On a cold November evening many years ago, Angus Macpherson, chief guard at the Newtown prison, yawned and closed his eyes. Angus had had a long and tiring day, and now, as the clock struck 11, the 3 platefuls of spaghetti bolognese he'd enjoyed at dinner were pulling him towards the deepest of deep sleeps. "I'll just have a little nap," he thought to himself. "All the cells are locked and everything's quiet. I'm sure nobody'll mind if I nod off for a while." Angus stretched out on a wooden bench and tried to relax, but for some reason he couldn't get off to sleep. Then he had an idea. "I know what the trouble is," he said to himself. "It's this belt of mine. It's much too tight." He rolled over, took off the belt, and dropped it onto the floor. A few minutes later, the stone corridors echoed to Angus Macpherson's unmistakable snore. In the darkness of cell 269, Frederick Carruthers, a bank manager who had lent himself £250,000, was planning his escape. "If I could get the keys off Macpherson's belt," he said to himself, "I could slip out through the side door, run across the yard, jump over the prison wall, and be back home for breakfast. But how do I do it?" Just then he caught sight of Angus's belt lying on the floor. "The keys," Carruthers whispered. "He's just dropped the belt with the keys. This is too good to be true." He tiptoed to the front of his cell and looked around. There was no one about. He took a deep breath, and then, softly and slowly, he stretched out his hand, picked up the belt, and lifted it back through the bars. Dawn broke over Newtown prison. Angus stretched, yawned, and half-opened his eyes. "I feel much better now," he said to himself. "I think that little nap did me good." He stood up and looked for his belt, but for some reason it wasn't on the floor where he'd dropped it. He yawned again and thought about going back to sleep, but then, to his surprise, he suddenly saw his belt hanging on a key which was in the lock of the open door of cell 269. Angus blinked twice. "Something's wrong here," he said to himself. "But what is it?" Gradually, shockingly, horrifyingly, the awful truth dawned on him. When Angus had at last worked out what had happened, he rushed down the corridor and ran up the steps to the prison governor's office. With his heart pounding, he banged on the door. "Governor! Governor!" he shouted. "Let me in! Let me in!" Sir Gerald Prescott was sitting at his desk reading the Times. "Come in," he said. "The door's open." Angus rushed in, his red face covered with sweat. "What's the matter, Macpherson?" the prison governor asked. "You look a bit upset." "It's Frederick Carruthers!" Angus shouted. "He's broken out of his cell and run away, and it was all my fault." "Now calm down," Sir Gerald said, "and go through the whole story very slowly right from the start." Angus sat down and took a deep breath. "Well, sir," he began, "last night I stretched out on a wooden bench near cell 269. I took off my belt and dropped it onto the floor. Then I nodded off for a few minutes. While I was asleep, Carruthers stretched out his hand, picked up the belt, and took off one of the keys. He opened his cell and slipped out through the side door." "But that's terrible!" the prison governor screamed, tearing up his Times and bursting into tears. Angus took a handkerchief out of his pocket and handed it to Sir Gerald. "Now, sir," he said, "there's no need to cry. It wasn't your fault that Carruthers escaped. I shouldn't have taken off my belt and nodded off like that. But don't worry, Governor. I'll make up for it. I'll give up my lunch break and go out and look for him and find out where he is." At that moment, Lady Prescott, the wife of the prison governor, arrived. "For goodness sake, stop crying, Gerald," she said, taking off her coat. "Pull yourself together, man. What's wrong with you? Why don't you grow up?" "I can't help it," the governor replied. "Yet another of my prisoners has run away. That's the 5th one this week. Why don't they like it here? Is it the prison food? Or the colour of the walls? Or my aftershave? I wish I knew." And with that, he burst into tears again. "That's it," Lady Prescott said, putting on her coat. "I've had enough of all this nonsense. I hate to see a grown man cry, and I'm not going to put up with it any longer. I'm leaving you, Gerald. I'm going to break up our marriage and run away to a run-down area of Birmingham." "But you can't do that," the prison governor cried. "If you run away to a run-down area of Birmingham, I'll have a nervous breakdown." "That's your problem, not mine," Lady Prescott replied. "I'm going to walk out of that door and you'll never see me again." "But I won't let you go," Sir Gerald shouted. "If you run away, I'll run after you." "If I run away to a run-down area and you run after me," Lady Prescott replied, "I'll run over you in my car." "Our car," the governor corrected her. "You should remember that we bought it together." "But you must be careful, my dear. If you run away to a run-down area of Birmingham and I run after you and you run over me in the car, you might then run into a tree, and the cost of repairing the damage could run into hundreds of pounds." "Money, money, money! That's all you care about!" Lady Prescott screamed. "Here am I, threatening to break up our marriage and run away to a run-down area of Birmingham, and all you can think about is the cost of repairing the car. Our car, if you run after me and I run over you and then run into a tree. That's so typical of you. Self, self, self. Me, me, me. I've had enough. I've run out of patience, Gerald. I'm off." "No, no, no! You can't do this to me!" the prison governor shouted, kneeling down and bursting into tears. "Look, I know I've not been a very good husband lately. I've been working too hard and putting on weight. But you can't walk out on me like this. If you went away, I'd go to pieces. I know what the problem is. I've been so wrapped up in my work that I've started to take you for granted. But don't leave me. Give me one last chance. I'll make up for it. I'll be putty in your hands. You name it and I'll do it. I'll take up jogging and take off weight. I'll give up smoking and wash up after dinner. I'll clear out the cupboards and take you out at weekends. Now, what could be fairer than that?" Lady Prescott turned round, threw an ashtray at Sir Gerald, knocked over a chair, and stormed out of the room. "Shall I go after her?" Angus asked from somewhere behind the armchair. "No," Sir Gerald replied softly, picking up the ashtray and putting it back on the table. "Let her go. She's made up her mind to run away to a run-down area of Birmingham, and there's nothing we can do." The prison governor sat down and straightened his tie. "I don't know what's got into her lately," he said, shaking his head. "She used to be so calm and quiet, but now she blows up all the time. I can't understand women, Angus. I just can't make them out. Why can't they be strong and logical like us men?" And with that, Sir Gerald took a handkerchief out of his pocket, blew his nose, and, not for the first time, burst into tears. By the time that Lady Prescott had stormed out of the office and Sir Gerald had straightened his tie and Angus had come out from behind the armchair, Frederick Carruthers was well on his way home. After he had slipped out through the side door, Frederick had run across the prison yard, climbed over a wall, and run off into the night. Having crossed the main road that links Newtown to Old Town, he had rolled down a hill, climbed over a couple of gates, crawled through a field full of turnips, waded through a swamp, dived into a stream, and swum across to the opposite bank, climbed up a hill, run across 6 kilometres of open countryside, jumped onto a train that was slowing down in front of a set of signals, run down the corridor to avoid the ticket collector, and then jumped off again as the train pulled into a station. While the other passengers were getting off the train, Frederick had slipped through the ticket barrier by showing his prison identification badge and shouting, "I'm a train engineer! I'm a train engineer! Let me through! Let me through!" Then he'd elbowed his way through a group of tourists, rushed down a flight of steps, run through a subway tunnel, and finally ended up standing outside a cafe at a lay-by near Junction 34 of the M1 motorway. It was at this moment that his problems really began. Frederick had been rushing, rolling, running, jumping, climbing, crawling, wading and swimming for several hours now, and the last meal he'd had was 3 biscuits and a glass of water before Angus had turned out the light in his cell. His exhausted body was beginning to complain. His stomach was crying out for food, and his throat felt like sandpaper. But what could he do? Prisoners don't carry money, and he didn't have a penny on him. Frederick looked through the windows of the cafe, and for the next few moments he went through a dreadful torture. "What have I done to deserve this?" he thought. "Here am I with my stomach rumbling and my throat parched, and I can't even afford a cup of tea. How did I get into this mess? And more to the point, how do I get out of it?" These were the thoughts running through Frederick Carruthers' troubled mind as a blue Rolls-Royce pulled into the lay-by and glided to a halt. The blue Rolls-Royce glided to a halt a few metres from where Frederick was standing. The driver wound down her window and leaned across. "Excuse me," she said. "Do you know anything about cars? I'm having a few problems with the steering, and I think I may have a puncture. Could you take a look for me?" "Yes, of course," Frederick said, and through his mind went the simple formula. Changing a wheel is work. Work brings money. Money brings food. The front left-hand wheel was hissing like a snake. Frederick bent down and ran his hand over the tyre. "You were lucky," he said. "This is a slow puncture. It could have been a lot worse." Then he pulled a large piece of glass out of the wheel and held it up. "That's what caused the problem," he said. "You must have picked it up along the way." Frederick walked to the back of the car and opened up the boot. Then he took out the spare wheel, a toolkit, a jack and a pump. He took off his jacket, hung it up on one of the wing mirrors, jacked up the car, took off the flat tyre, put on the spare wheel, which he then pumped up a little, and finally, having done all that, he put the old wheel, the toolkit, the jack and the pump back in the boot. "You've been so kind," the lady said. Frederick nodded, smiled and held out his hand. "Now, can I give you a lift anywhere? I'm on my way to Birmingham. Would that be any good for you? Perhaps I can drop you off somewhere along the way." Frederick's face dropped. He'd been expecting money or food, and he felt a bit let down. But then it suddenly dawned on him that the offer of a free ride in a Rolls-Royce far away from Newtown might be quite a good idea. "That's very kind of you," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth and getting into the car. "Birmingham would be just fine." The woman got in, put on her seatbelt, took off the handbrake, put the car into first gear, looked in the rear-view mirror, and pulled gently out of the lay-by. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, they roared onto the M1 motorway like a bullet from a gun. "The steering's fine now," the lady said as the blue Rolls-Royce sped on down the M1. "I'm very grateful to you, Mr. Carruthers. Frederick Carruthers." "Now that name rings a bell," the woman said. "I'm sure I've come across it somewhere before, but I can't quite place it. And so tell me, Mr. Carruthers, what do you do?" Frederick paused. He looked out of the window and waved his hand in a rather vague way. I'm in prisons," he said. "Well, I never! Isn't that a coincidence?" the woman replied. "So is my husband. Perhaps you've heard of him. His name is Sir Gerald Prescott." Frederick sank lower in his seat. "Your husband?" he said, as a cold shiver ran down his spine. "Your husband is Sir Gerald Prescott, the governor of Newtown Jail?" "That's right," the woman replied. "Do you know him?" Not personally," Frederick said, "but I, know of him. He has quite a reputation in my field." "Does he? Does he indeed?" the driver said with a soft and bitter laugh. "Huh! Well, I'm sure it's a reputation for childish, incompetent stupidity. My husband has the intelligence of a pineapple and the imagination of a doughnut." Lady Prescott's voice grew louder as she warmed to her subject. "Sir Gerald is the weakest, the stupidest, the meanest, and the most selfish man to walk this earth." Frederick wanted to move on to another topic, like the weather or the price of cauliflowers, but it was no good. Lady Prescott was getting carried away, and there was just no stopping her now. "Sir Gerald's nickname is Niagara, because he keeps bursting into tears," she screamed like a dragon breathing fire. "When I first met him, he was a tiger, but he's turned into a kitten. He's a stubborn, ignorant jelly, and he drives me up the wall." Frederick sat in a state of shock, trying to squeeze words through his frozen lips. But it was just no good. His mouth opened and closed like a demented goldfish, and although he did manage a few incoherent grunts, none of the sounds came out right. So, recognizing defeat, he gave up trying to change the subject, sat back, and just watched the volcano erupt. Frederick's mind was not at peace. Here he was, sitting in a Rolls-Royce, driven by the wife of the governor of the prison he'd just escaped from. He was mumbling, his stomach was rumbling, his confidence was crumbling, and Lady Prescott was grumbling. "Perhaps I should have stayed in my cell," he thought, as the driver put her foot down and the blue Rolls-Royce roared on. By the time they arrived at the outskirts of Birmingham, Lady Prescott had calmed down a little, and Frederick was feeling a bit more relaxed. And as we pick up the story again at 1:23 p.m, our two characters have started to get on surprisingly well. The blue Rolls-Royce slowed down, and they drew up in front of a row of shabby terraced houses. "Do you see number 42? The one with the pale green door?" Lady Prescott said. "I was born there, and this little run-down street on the edge of the city is where I grew up. Whenever I feel down, I come back here. This will always be my home. It's dirty and messy, and some of the shops are boarded up. But as far as I'm concerned, this is the best place in the world." Lady Prescott put on the handbrake, took off her seatbelt, and stepped out of the car. "And now, Mr. Carruthers, I'm going for a walk," she said. "Would you like me to show you around?" "Oh, that would be very kind of you," Frederick replied. "But I don't want to put you to any trouble." "It would be no trouble at all," Lady Prescott said. "In fact, you'd be doing me a favour. I've got a lot of things on my mind at the moment, and I need someone to talk to, so I'd be very grateful if you came and walked with me." Lady Prescott locked the car, and they set off across the market square on a tour of the town. "Has it changed much over the years?" Frederick asked as they came over the narrow stone bridge that crossed the canal. "No, not really," Lady Prescott replied. "They've done up some of the houses, like these ones here, but most of the properties are falling down or falling apart. Whenever there's an election, the politicians come round and knock on the door. They promise to pull down the terraced housing and build some new flats. But after the votes are counted, they never seem to get round to it. It's strange that, isn't it? And anyway, I'd be a bit sad if they knocked everything down and put up one of those ugly tower blocks. Perhaps it's better to keep it the way it is. I don't want them tearing down my childhood. They should leave my home alone." "You say this is your home," Frederick said. "But then why did you go away?" "Oh, that's simple," Lady Prescott replied. "I fell in love. Strange though it may seem, I left Birmingham to be with Gerald Prescott, the gutless, brainless, spineless fool who is now governor of Newtown Prison." You look a bit surprised, Mr. Carruthers. Then perhaps I should explain. There was a time when my husband was a bright, tender young man. It's only recently that he's turned into a workaholic who eats, drinks and sleeps prison life. I met him when I was just 18. I was in my last term at school, and Gerald was studying at the local technical college. He was absolutely broke, and so he'd taken a part-time job at a takeaway restaurant called the Birmingham Big Burger Bar. The takeaway was in Crawford Street. It was on my way home from school. One day I went in to get some chips. Gerald was serving behind the counter. He smiled at me, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. After that, I went to the takeaway every day. I wasn't hungry. I just wanted to see Gerald. Anyway, one afternoon he asked me out, and we went for a walk in the park. We got on really well, and I started seeing him all the time. He used to walk me to school in the morning, and he'd come and pick me up when the classes were over. And then, all of a sudden, I fell in love with him. I don't know why. It just happened that way. When my father found out what was going on, he went crazy. He didn't want his only daughter going out with someone who cooked hamburgers in a takeaway. He told me that I had to stop seeing Gerald straight away. I had to make a choice. Should I obey my father and split up with the person I loved, or should I defy my parents and go on seeing him? It didn't take me long to make up my mind. I knew that I couldn't give Gerald up, and so I had to work out some way of deceiving my parents. The plan was simple. I pretended that I'd obeyed my father. I said that I'd broken up with Gerald. I cried for 2 or 3 days and went through 10 packets of tissues. I stopped eating and slammed lots of doors. I put on a really good show. My parents were completely taken in. But whenever my father's back was turned, I would slip out of the house and go and meet Gerald secretly. In the park or at the takeaway. When I came home, I made up some story or other to explain where I'd been. I was at a friend's house playing records, or I was visiting a museum in the centre of the town. My father seemed happy that I'd suddenly made lots of new friends who had money in their pockets and didn't cook burgers. But he didn't know what I was really up to. Lady Prescott suddenly broke off, and for the next minute or so they walked on in silence. Frederick looked straight ahead. He said nothing. There was no need to talk. They crossed a main road and walked past a school. And then, as they turned down a narrow side street, Lady Prescott picked up the story again. On my last day at school, Gerald asked me to marry him. As you can imagine, I felt tremendously flattered, but I turned him down. I told him I was just too young to settle down. I needed more time to think things through. For the next few months we played a sort of game. He kept on proposing and I kept on saying no. But then, one night, it was May the 10th, everything changed. I told my father I was going to a poetry reading in the local town hall. In fact, I slipped out of the side door and went to the cinema with Gerald. When the film was over, we caught the last bus home, but along the way, the bus broke down, and all the passengers had to get off and walk. It was 4 miles from the city centre to my house, and by the time we got home it was very late. Gerald saw me to the door, kissed me on the cheek, and then said good night. It was now 2 o'clock in the morning. I took out my key and let myself in as quietly as I could. My father was waiting for me in the hall. He normally went to bed at about 11, but that night he decided to stay up until I got in. He was furious. He'd seen Gerald bringing me to the door, and at that moment he'd realised what had been going on behind his back. I'd never seen my father so angry. I thought he was going to hit me, so I ran past him and went straight up to bed. The next morning at breakfast we had a huge row. He shouted at me, I shouted at him, and it ended up with me packing a suitcase and storming out of the house. I went straight round to Gerald's flat and we decided to run away. Can you imagine it? Me and Gerald running away. Anyway, to cut a long story short, we eloped to Newtown and got married in the local church. It was a very quiet wedding. Just me, Gerald, the vicar and a couple of witnesses. All very romantic. As soon as the service was over, I rang up my parents to tell them what we'd done. My father was stunned and hurt. He lost his temper and slammed down the phone. For the next few months we went through a really bad patch. I didn't go back to the house, and whenever I rang home there were long pregnant pauses. It was all very awkward. But then one day Gerald went round to see my father. They had a long talk, and somehow they sorted the whole thing out. I made it up with my parents, and since then we've been very close. And I suppose that now, looking back, I can appreciate what my mother and father were going through. I was their only daughter, and they didn't think my husband was good enough for me. After all, when Gerald was younger, he wasn't exactly rolling in money. He was so hard up that he'd use the same tea bag for a week. He owned 3 socks, and they all had holes in them. His shirt sleeves were frayed, and his trousers were held up with string. Lady Prescott sighed and smiled. A single tear ran down her cheek. "Ah, those were happy days," she said. Lady Prescott broke off, and, once again, they walked on in silence. It was now mid-afternoon, and the streets were empty. There was a stillness in the cool summer air, as if the world had paused for thought. No birds sang, no cows mooed, no ducks quacked, no sheep baaed, no dogs woofed, no cats meowed. In fact, on that bright, soft, tranquil day, there was only one sound to be heard. The low, continuous rumbling of Frederick's empty stomach, for 24 hours starved of food. They walked down a couple of alleyways, and then, as they turned into the main road, they came upon a postman riding a bicycle. The bicycle was very old, and it had no springs, and so, as he rode across the cobblestones, he seemed to be nodding his head and shaking his head all at the same time. Lady Prescott was talking again. "Do you know where we are, Mr. Carruthers? This is Crawford Street, and at the end of this row of shops, there's the Birmingham Big Burger Bar where I met Gerald all those years ago. Look, I don't know about you, but I'm starving. Why don't we pop in there and have a late lunch? They serve the best beef burgers in town." Frederick seemed a little agitated. "I could do with a meal too," he said, "but I'm afraid I don't have a penny on me. You see, I went out in rather a hurry last night." Lady Prescott smiled. "But you must be my guest, Mr. Carruthers. You've gone out of your way to help me, and you put up with all my complaints about Sir Gerald. Paying for lunch will be my way of paying you back for all your kindness. Come on, I insist. I've had a long and difficult day. I'm tired out and very worked up about my husband. I need a good meal to calm me down, and I don't want to eat alone." Lady Prescott was right about the food. It was definitely the best burger that Frederick had ever tasted. But that was hardly surprising. He was so hungry that he could have eaten the serviettes and the cheap blue plastic tray. Lady Prescott looked at her watch. "It's 3 o'clock, she said. "I've been rabbiting on about my problems for over an hour now. Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to burden you. It's just that after my bust-up with Sir Gerald, I suppose I needed someone to talk to." She paused. There was something on her mind. "Mr. Carruthers, I want to ask you a question," she began, her voice now somewhat colder than before. "When I drove into that lay-by, you were standing around with your hands in your pockets looking like a down-and-out." But you have an honest, kindly face, and you're obviously an intelligent man. So, how did you end up like that? There must be something wrong, and I think it's time for you to tell me the truth. Why were you wandering around near the motorway with no money in your pocket and those very strange clothes?" Frederick said nothing. He looked down at the table and stirred his coffee with a spoon. He didn't know what to do. He wanted to explain things, but he wasn't sure whether he could trust Lady Prescott. After all, she was the wife of the governor of the prison he'd just escaped from. If she found out that he was a convict on the run, perhaps she'd turn him in, and then he might end up in cell 269 again. Frederick looked up. "You're right, of course," he said, breaking the silence. "It is strange that I should be drifting around with nowhere to go. And yes, I am in trouble. But if I told you what I've gone through in the past few months, you might get angry, and that would make things worse." Lady Prescott finished off her French fries and smiled. "You've no reason to be afraid," she said. "If you're in trouble, then you need help. And if there's something on your mind, you shouldn't just bottle it up inside you. You should tell me about it and get it off your chest. Then you'd feel a lot better. And I give you my word that I won't get angry whatever you say." Frederick sighed. "Perhaps you're right," he said. "And, after all, what have I got to lose? Well, the truth is that up until 2 years ago I was leading a very simple and predictable life. I had a steady job, a beautiful home, and a loving family. Then, all of a sudden, something happened that changed everything. My whole world just fell apart." Frederick broke off. He seemed a little uneasy. "Go on," Lady Prescott said gently. "Well, it's a very long story," Frederick replied, "and I don't really know where to begin." "Try the beginning," said Lady Prescott, putting a straw into her milkshake. "I'm in no hurry. I'm going to drink this very, very slowly." Frederick took a deep breath and picked up the story again. "My mother is a nurse in a small hospital," he said. "She looks after sick children. She's a wonderful, extraordinary woman, and she works incredibly hard. One day I drove down to the hospital to pick my mother up after work. We were going out to dinner. I parked the car, and as I was walking through one of the wards, I could hear a child crying very softly. I looked across and saw a little boy. He must have been about 8 or 9. He was so ill that he couldn't sit up in bed properly. He had to lie against pillows all day long. It was terrible. He was pale, lifeless, too weak to move. The next day I rang up the manager of the hospital and asked about the little boy. She told me that all the children in that ward had problems with their kidneys. "And is there nothing you can do?" I asked. "I'm afraid not," she said. "What we really need is 6 kidney machines. Then the children would be able to get out of bed and walk around the ward. But unfortunately, the hospital is very short of money. We're so hard up that we can't afford to buy 1 machine, let alone 6. So I'm afraid the children will just have to suffer." When I put down the phone, I felt terribly disturbed. It was so sad, so shocking, so unfair. I decided that I had to find a way to help the children. I couldn't stand by and do nothing. At first I couldn't think what to do, but then, all of a sudden, I came up with an idea. I was a bank manager, and a lot of money passed through my hands. During a normal working day, I would write out 10, maybe 12 official checks for different things: stationery, coffee, furniture, stamps, and so on. I'd worked at the bank for 30 years, so everybody knew me, and nobody ever checked up on what I was doing. I suppose I had an honest face, and they just trusted me. One afternoon, It was a Wednesday. I called my secretary into the office and told her to cancel my appointments. When she'd left the room, I took the phone off the hook and drew the curtains. Then I took the official checkbook out of the safe and wrote a cheque to myself. Pay Mr. F. Carruthers £100 only. Signed, Frederick Carruthers. It was breathtakingly, outrageously simple. A bank manager stealing money from his own bank. At the age of 45, I was about to commit my first crime. I looked at the cheque. My head was spinning. This was robbery. Was I doing the right thing? Could I get away with it? Should I just tear up the cheque and throw it away? Perhaps I should forget about the whole thing. But then I thought about the children in the hospital. They needed the money more than the bank. I was stealing it for them. So I took a deep breath, folded the cheque up and put it into my pocket. I left the office and took a taxi to another branch of the bank. I knew one of the cashiers there. We chatted for a while, and then, with my heart pounding, I paid the cheque into my current account. 3 days later, the payment cleared. I had stolen my first £100. The following week, I did the whole thing again. Another cheque, the same branch, the same cashier, the same fear, the same excitement when the money was cleared into my account. And so it went on. Week after week, I stole money from the bank, and each cheque was a little bigger than the last. You've no idea how I felt. I was risking everything I had, my career, my family life, my reputation, but nothing was going to stop me now. The image of the little boy crying on his pillow haunted me. I couldn't get it out of my mind, and I had to do something to help. I think the next few weeks were the most exciting of my life. In some strange way, I'd suddenly come alive. I was sharp, human, burning with anger, and I suppose I got a bit carried away. I was soon writing cheques for £5,000 and £10,000. It was crazy. Sometimes the cashier seemed a bit suspicious. She couldn't work out what the payments were for, but each week I made up some new story to explain the cheques away, and she fell for it every time. I suppose it never occurred to her that Frederick Carruthers, a punctual, conscientious friend, could have turned into a common thief, an embezzler, a liar, a man obsessed. By that summer, I'd managed to save up £250,000. One morning I didn't go into work. I walked into the hospital and wrote out a cheque for every penny I had. The manager went straight out and bought 6 new kidney machines. A few days later we had a small ceremony in the ward. It was a bit like launching a ship or opening a bridge. I unwrapped the machines, plugged them in and switched them on. And then, as the lights flashed, the children gave me a round of applause that seemed to go on forever. I felt very proud. It was the best moment of my life. But then, inevitably, I suppose, my luck failed. Someone at head office became suspicious. How could a branch manager afford to donate £250,000 to a hospital? The head of finance went to the central computer and started going through my account. She noticed that I'd been building up large amounts of cash. But how could I save up so much money on the salary I earned? She smelt a rat, and when she looked into the strange dealings on the branch account, she knew that something was wrong. Anyway, it wasn't long before she put 2 and 2 together and worked out what I'd been up to. She tipped off the police, and when I turned up for work the next morning, there were 3 detectives waiting in my office. They took me down to the police station, and that was it. I was charged with theft, and my world just fell apart. The trial was fixed for December the 18th, just 1 week before Christmas. 2 days before I was due in court, a director of the bank came to see me. He came straight to the point. He offered me a deal. He said they would drop all the charges if I paid the money back. "But how can I do that?" I asked. "The hospital have spent it all." "That's simple," the man said. Tell the hospital that you've changed your mind. Tell them it was a mistake. Just tell them to send the machines back." "But what about the children?" I said. The man shrugged his shoulders. "Our bank is a business, Mr. Carruthers. It's not a charity. And if you don't get our money back, you'll end up in jail. It's as simple as that. It's up to you. But you can't have it both ways." He stood up. "We're going to give you 24 hours to think it over," he said. "You don't have to decide right away. You can sleep on it. I'll come back tomorrow and you can tell me what you've decided. But just remember one thing, Mr. Carruthers. You can't rip the bank off and expect to get away with it. Life's not like that, and we will hunt you down until we get every penny of our money back. I trust I've made myself clear. Good afternoon." That night I lay awake in my cell and thought the whole thing through. Was I being stupid? Should I save my own skin? Was it all worth fighting for? I went over it again and again. The man from the bank came back the next day. He walked into my cell with a stupid smirk on his face. He was so sure of himself, so confident. He thought I was going to give in without a fight. He sat down and grinned at me. And at that moment, I noticed he had false teeth. "So, Mr. Carruthers," he began, "I trust that you've come to your senses. I've prepared this letter for you to sign. It instructs the hospital to send the items in question back to the factory, and—" I held up my hand, and the man from the bank stopped talking. "You can save your breath," I said. "Put the letter away. I've got no intention of signing it. I've decided to go through with the trial. I can't let the children down. I promised them 6 kidney machines, and I'm not going back on my word." The man from the bank gaped at me, and his false teeth fell out. They crashed noisily onto the floor and rolled under my bed. I bent down, picked them up, and handed them back to him. "I believe these are yours," I said. You should have seen his face. And so the trial went ahead. I pleaded guilty. The judge sentenced me to 3 years in jail, and that's how I ended up in... Frederick paused and took a deep breath. "In Newtown Prison, from where I escaped at 11 o'clock last night." Lady Prescott blinked twice. She didn't seem at all shocked or upset by the fact that Frederick was a convict on the run from her husband's jail. In fact, her one and only concern was for the children in the ward. "There's one thing I don't understand," Lady Prescott said. "Why didn't you tell the court what you did with the money? Then they would have seen things in a different light. They would have reduced your sentence. They might even have let you off." "I thought of that," Frederick replied. "But then the judge would have ordered the hospital to sell the machines and pay the money back. And that was the last thing I wanted. I may have got out of going to prison, but what would have happened to the children? I couldn't take that risk." Lady Prescott shook her head. "I can't decide if you were very brave or very stupid," she said. "But I have to admire what you did. And you nearly got away with it. You were really quite unlucky. Now, I don't condone stealing. Theft is theft, and you deserve to be punished. But after 2 years in jail, you've paid off your debt." A silence fell between them. Frederick was staring deep into his coffee. Telling the story of the kidney machines had brought back some painful memories, and he suddenly felt very down. "How could a good man end up like this?" Lady Prescott thought. "He's falling apart. I must help him. I can't just stand by and do nothing." And with that, she suddenly stood up and picked up her bag. "Would you excuse me, Mr. Carruthers?" she said. "I've a couple of calls to make." Lady Prescott walked over to the payphone in the corner of the room. She took a yellow diary out of the bag and looked up a number. Then she picked up the receiver, put some coins into the slot and started dialing. Frederick turned his face and looked out at Crawford Street. There were now lots of people about. It was 3:30 and the local school had just broken up for the day. A young girl came in and ordered some chips. Lady Prescott finished her first call and put down the phone. Then she turned round and looked across at Frederick. He was miles away, staring out of the window. She picked up the phone again and dialed a second number. A few minutes later she was through. "Is that Newtown Prison?" she whispered. "This is Lady Prescott. I want to speak to my husband." Lady Prescott came back to the table and sat down. "I made a call to a friend of mine, Mr. Carruthers. She'd like to meet you. I said we'd be in her office just after 5, so why don't you drink up your coffee and eat up your cheeseburger and finish off the French fries, and then we can set off." "But where are we going?" Frederick said. "And who is your friend?" "For the moment, that must remain a secret," Lady Prescott replied. "But she's an important woman, and I think she can help you. Oh, and do cheer up, Mr. Carruthers. You mustn't worry so much. It'll all work out in the end." Frederick drank up his coffee, ate up his cheeseburger, finished off his French fries, and then stood up. They walked back to the car, along Crawford Street, down a couple of side alleys, over the stone bridge that crossed the canal, and a few minutes later the blue Rolls-Royce was on the road again. Frederick was exhausted. The last 24 hours were beginning to catch up with him, and as the car sped on down the motorway, he closed his eyes and gently nodded off, falling ever deeper into sleep. A couple of hours later, Frederick felt someone tapping on his shoulder. "Come along, Mr. Carruthers," Lady Prescott said. "Wake up, we're nearly there." Frederick woke up with a start, and at first he thought he was still dreaming, because there, right ahead of them, was a vast glass and metal building that he knew all too well. But this was no dream, and their car was heading straight for the main entrance. "Where are you taking me?" Frederick shouted. "This is the head office of my old bank. You set me up, haven't you? You're going to turn me in. I should never have trusted you. Stop the car right now. Let me out." Frederick took off his seatbelt and tried to get out of the car, but Lady Prescott turned round and dragged him back inside. "For goodness sake, calm down, Mr. Carruthers," she said. "I haven't set you up, and I'm not going to turn you in. And don't get so worked up. You're as bad as my husband. Now just listen to me. When we were in the takeaway, I rang up your head office and fixed up an appointment with Karen Blackstone. She's a good friend of mine. We went to school together." "Karen Blackstone?" Frederick said. "But she's the managing director of the bank." "Exactly, Mr. Carruthers. And we're on our way to her office. She's going to give you a new job." "You must be joking," said Frederick. "The bank would never dream of taking me on again. I've got a criminal record for stealing their money." "Well, just you wait and see," Lady Prescott replied. "I think you're in for a surprise." The blue Rolls-Royce pulled up in front of a huge skyscraper that seemed to pierce the clouds. They got out of the car and walked through into the main lobby. Then they made their way to the managing director's penthouse suite. As the lift rose smoothly to the 89th floor, Frederick broke out into a cold sweat. 1,000 thoughts were running through his mind. Could he really trust Lady Prescott? Was he walking into a trap? Would the police be there to arrest him again? And what would Karen Blackstone make of his clothes? He stared at himself in the mirror. He wasn't exactly dressed up for the occasion. In the past 24 hours, he'd crawled through mud, swum across lakes, climbed up trees, jumped onto trains, rolled down hills, and put a spare wheel onto the blue Rolls-Royce. And now, after all that, he looked like a scarecrow in a thunderstorm. The stains on his shirt and his crumpled prison trousers didn't quite fit in with the thick pile carpet and the soft leather chairs. When the lift doors opened, they were met by a tall, angular secretary, who took one look at Frederick's bedraggled appearance and gave a shrill sniff of disapproval. The woman showed them into the managing director's office and sniffed again. Then she turned and closed the door behind her. With the introductions over, Karen Blackstone sat down and picked up a pencil. "Right, let's get down to business," she said. "I've been going through your file, Mr. Carruthers. As far as I can see, you were a model employee. Punctual, industrious, conscientious, loyal. Then came the incident with the kidney machines, and you threw away 30 years of hard work. But there are two things in your favour. You know the bank inside out, and you're obviously committed to charity work. And that makes you just the person we're looking for." "What do you mean?" asked Frederick. "I don't understand." "Then let me explain," Karen Blackstone said. "Over the past few months, the bank has run into some problems. For some reason, we've been losing a lot of business. It's a worrying trend. And so, last week, we carried out a survey to find out what's wrong. We discovered, Mr. Carruthers, that the bank is not universally loved. It seems that because we don't sponsor operas or football teams or dog shows, people think we're mean. The public sees us as selfish, ruthless and greedy. To put it bluntly, our image puts people off. But this can't go on, and so something has to change. I want the bank to come across in a more human, caring way. I want people to look on us as a friend, not as an enemy. I want people to come to us with their problems. And with their cash," Frederick said. Karen Blackstone carried on talking, ignoring that last remark. "Now, when I heard the story of you and the kidney machines, it set me thinking. We make a solid return on our capital, and it wouldn't do us any harm to give away some of those profits to worthy causes in the community, hospitals, voluntary groups, youth clubs, and so on. Just think of it, Mr. Carruthers. Just think of all the good we could do." "And just think of it, Mrs. Blackstone," Frederick said. "Just think of all that tax-deductible cheap publicity." The managing director smiled, and then picked up her theme again. "And this is where you come in, Mr. Carruthers. I'd like you to come back to the bank and set the whole thing up. I'm offering you a new job, head of charity donations." "And if I was to take up this new challenge," Frederick said, "you'd expect me to keep quiet about the events of 2 years ago. You wouldn't want me to reveal how I showed up the flaws in your security system. In other words, you want to buy my silence." Karen Blackstone was drumming her pencil on the table. "Let's be practical, Mr. Carruthers. Not every convict can leave prison and walk straight back into a job. It's very simple. I need you, and you need me. It's a case of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. I think we understand each other perfectly." And so a deal was struck. Frederick got a new job, and Karen Blackstone got a promise that the head of charity donations would never let on how to rip off the bank. "You'll have your new contract in the morning," Karen Blackstone said. "But where shall I send the papers to?" The question hung in the air like a vulture. It suddenly dawned on Frederick that he couldn't take up a new job until he'd served out his term in jail, and he just didn't know what to say. Lady Prescott leaned forward. "If I could just butt in here," she said. "I think I've sorted out that problem too. I made 2 phone calls from the takeaway, Mr. Carruthers. The first was to Karen, as you know. The second was to my husband. And you'll be leaving prison much sooner than you think." It was now 5:35, and the blue Rolls-Royce was coming home. "Could you tell me what's going on?" Frederick said. "I'm getting a bit confused." "Well, it's all quite simple," Lady Prescott replied. "I'm going back to my husband. We had a long talk on the phone, and we sorted a few things out." "But where does that leave me?" Frederick asked. Are you going to turn me in?" "Not exactly," Lady Prescott smiled. "I'm going to smuggle you back into the prison, and then the governor's going to let you out." Frederick seemed a bit confused. "I'm not with you," he said. Lady Prescott took a deep breath. "Gerald tells me that you served 2/3 of your sentence. And since you've been a model prisoner, you're now due for parole. There was no need for you to run off like that. They were going to let you out anyway." Frederick was getting lost again. "Let me put it another way," Lady Prescott said. "If you'd stayed in instead of breaking out, the governor would have let you off the last 12 months of your sentence and let you out 1 year early." Frederick's eyebrows collided with each other. The demented goldfish had returned. Lady Prescott pulled in and stopped the car. "We'll be there in a few minutes," she said. "I've taken a blanket out of the boot. I think it's time for you to hide." Frederick had given up trying to work out what was going on, so, rather sulkily, he climbed over onto the back seat and covered himself up. A few moments later, the blue Rolls-Royce moved off again and headed for Newtown. By the time they arrived at the prison gates, night was falling. Lady Prescott slowed down and stopped the car. Then she wound down her window and leaned across. "Good evening, Mr. Thomas," she said. "And how are you tonight?" The guard smiled. "I'm fine, thanks, ma'am. We're very glad to see you again." He saluted, pressed a button, and waved the car through. The huge iron gates swung open, and Lady Prescott drove through into the main prison square. Then she turned down a dimly lit alley, where she slowed down and parked the car. She flashed her headlights, and Angus, for some reason wearing a false moustache and a pair of dark glasses, came out from behind a large grey dustbin and waved. Lady Prescott got out of the car and looked around. There was no one else about. "You can come out now, Mr. Carruthers," she whispered. "The coast is clear, and Mr. Macpherson is waiting for you." Frederick slipped out of the car and ran down the alley. "Welcome back, sir," Angus said. "I'm so glad to see you again. I thought I was going to lose my job when you disappeared. I shouldn't have nodded off, you see. It was all my fault." Frederick smiled, and they slipped through a side gate into the main wing of the prison. Angus took the keys off his belt and unlocked cell 269. Then he pushed open the door and stepped back. "After you, Mr. Carruthers," he said. "After you." Frederick walked into the cell and sat down. "It feels so strange to be back here," he said. 6 hours ago I was in the Birmingham Big Burger Bar eating a cheeseburger and French fries. 3 hours later I was in the head office of the bank. And now I'm here in the darkness of a prison cell. It's been quite a day, Angus. I'll be glad when this whole thing is over and I can get back to my old routine." Lady Prescott, in the meantime, had climbed the steps to the governor's office. Sir Gerald was waiting nervously by the door. He'd obviously dressed up for the occasion, combing his hair, polishing his shoes, and putting on the spotted pink tie that Lady Prescott had given him on their silver wedding anniversary. History does not record what issues of domestic importance were discussed that evening in the Prescott household, but there is a rumour that the next morning Sir Gerald went out and bought a new pair of rubber washing-up gloves and a book called How to Flatten Your Stomach and Lose Your Double Chin. That weekend, the governor brought the parole forms down to Frederick's cell. "I owe you a great deal, Mr. Carruthers," he said. "Your escape was a blessing in disguise. The events of the last 24 hours have taught me a lot. I've come to appreciate just how good my life is. Oh, and by the way, my wife has told me all about the kidney machines and the children in the ward. I think you were very brave. I rang up the Home Office last night, and we've fixed up your parole. We're going to give you 12 months off for good behaviour. That means we'll be letting you out on Monday." Now, there's just one more thing we have to sort out. The other prisoners don't know that you escaped. Angus and I hushed the whole thing up. So if anyone asks where you've been for the past 24 hours, just say that we thought you'd gone down with German measles. We took you up to the hospital wing and called in a doctor, but it turned out that you had a rash or an allergy or something which cleared up overnight. You can make up any story you like, but don't let on that you managed to break out. Otherwise, Angus and I will be out of a job. Frederick began to laugh. "Your secret is safe with me, Governor," he said. "And anyway, if anyone found out that I ran away, I couldn't get parole. So it's in my interest to hush everything up too." Dawn broke over Newtown Prison. It was Monday, and Frederick Carruthers was going home. Sir Gerald, Lady Prescott and Angus stood by the front gates to see him off. They shook hands and talked for a few minutes. Then the huge iron gates swung open, and Frederick walked out onto the street. It was a strange feeling to be truly free again, like having a canvas and a brush and not knowing what to paint. But Frederick was looking forward to doing the simple things again, walking the dogs after Sunday lunch, browsing in bookshops, fishing in the canal. The family were there to meet him. They'd stood by him through all the ups and downs of the past 2 years, and now there was so much to say, so much to do, so much lost time to make up for. A few days later, a table was reserved at the best Italian restaurant in Newtown, and that night the Carruthers family, Angus Macpherson, and Sir Gerald and Lady Prescott dined out in style. There was only one topic of conversation, but that's often the way at the best parties. Frederick told the story of the night of his escape, how he had swum across a river, crawled through a field of turnips, and jumped on and off trains. Angus described how he'd broken out into a cold sweat when he'd woken up and found out that Frederick had managed to break out and run away. Sir Gerald explained how they'd made up a story that Frederick had gone down with a particularly contagious form of German measles in an attempt to hush up news of the breakout, and Lady Prescott recounted the story of driving into a lay-by and coming across a shabby down-and-out with such a kindly, honest face. At 10:30, just after the 4th course, but some time before the 5th, Angus looked at his watch and sighed. "Oh, I'll have to go now," he said. "I'm on duty in half an hour." He stood up and said goodbye to Mrs. Carruthers, the children, Sir Gerald and Lady Prescott. Then he turned and thanked Frederick for the meal. "Thank you, Angus," Frederick replied. "None of this would have been possible if you hadn't let me escape. You've changed my life. I owe you a lot." Angus blushed a deep shade of red and looked down at the floor. "All's well that ends well," he said, doing up his coat. Frederick smiled and patted him on the shoulder. Angus left the restaurant and walked back along the peaceful streets of Newtown. When he came to the prison gates, he knocked on the front door and the night guard let him in. Angus clocked on, put on his uniform, and then went through the corridors, checking the cells and turning off the lights. Everything was in order. The prisoners had settled down for the night, and the jail was locked and still. Angus yawned and sat down on a small wooden bench. He was tired, and now, as the clock struck 11, the French fries, the Welsh rabbit made with blue cheese, the Scotch egg covered with French dressing, the steak well done, and the 3 platefuls of spaghetti bolognese he'd enjoyed at dinner were pulling him towards the deepest of deep sleeps. "I'll just have a little nap," he thought to himself. "I'm sure nobody will mind if I nod off for a while." He stretched out, took off his belt, and dropped it onto the floor. A few minutes later, the stone corridors echoed to Angus Macpherson's unmistakable snores. Meanwhile, in the darkness of cell 269, Angela Richardson, an athlete who had run off with the membership fees of her local sports club, was planning her escape. But that, as they say, is another story.